Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tony de los Reyes. I'm one of the moderators for today. I would like to thank the Department of Cultural Affairs for hosting us. It's a terrific exhibition, and we all are very appreciative of all the work they've been doing in regards to supporting Los Angeles artists. I'm going to start off with the main question for today's Salon conversation. Regarding technology and innovation in art making, what are the strongest elements in the cultural context of Los Angeles that encourage artists to employ new technologies? And what excites LA artists to take intellectual and conceptual risks in advancing the boundaries of traditional art media? So we're going to go around, and everyone's going to testify to some of those questions about technology, how we use it in our practice, how it impacts Los Angeles, how we utilize Los Angeles as part of our own practice. But first, Amy is going to give us a great quote about Los Angeles that she just brought to my attention.
Thank you, Tony. This is a Frank Lloyd Wright quote, which I think is appropriate for the venue here. Tip the world over on its side and everything loose will land in Los Angeles. Here we are. So,
Just briefly introduce yourself. Say if you could just describe part of your practice and how technology is a part of it as an Angelino artist, and we'll just briefly go around and introduce ourselves to each other.
Okay, my name is Karen Atkinson, and technology, I use technology in my work in a lot of different ways, both low technology and high technology. To me, they're both incredibly important. So I might create a project that uses the most forward technology that's happening, but then I'll also figure out perhaps a way to distribute a project in the lowest technology possible. So one might be something that's computer driven, but it's actually distributed in a very old-fashioned way. I also, if someone had told me 20 years ago that I would be a software developer, I would have told them they were nuts. But I think the city of LA and the artists in LA have inspired me to work really hard to try to make life better for artists through an organization that I started called Getting Your Shit Together.
I'm Margaret Honda, and I work in sculpture and film, and for both of those things, I've actually utilized, I think, a lot of the resources that are really specific to Los Angeles. Early on, people were able to do a lot with the technology that came from the aerospace and defense industries, and those things have actually, I think, helped me a bit in my work. And also, most recently, I've been working with working in film, and the film industry itself is something that's that has been developing a lot in terms of working digitally, working with virtual reality. Not that I'm doing those things, but it is here for people to use. So it's sort of like the city has enabled a lot of people to do things that they probably can do other places, but because the concentration of people who are working along those lines is so great here, it's a wonderful resource.
My name is Joe Davidson. I am a sculptor here. And in terms of technology, I mean, my work is in some way feels kind of traditional compared to what a lot of people are doing right now. But I do a lot of work like in plastics, and I do a lot of like foams and things like that, which is I always think about it as it associates with like props and like the film industry and stuff like that. So I end up using a lot of these materials that I associate with more like filmmaking. And yeah, it's one of the great things about having this resource of Los Angeles to find these materials, to find things that you would not find if you were in, say, like a smaller city or in a rural area or a rural part of the country. Like a lot of these things are kind of, they're not necessarily developed here, but some of them are, and some of them, you know, like the resources and all the newer kind of technological materials seem to come out from around here, which is what makes LA an exciting place to make work.
Yeah, my name is Scott Uriu, and basically I'm going to echo a lot of what has been said before. But yeah, our work is definitely pseudo quasi sculptural, habitable sculptural pieces. So I'm from a partnership Baumgartner and Uriu, and Herwig Baumgartner and myself. And yeah, Los Angeles, we wouldn't exist without Los Angeles. There's no doubt about it. He's Austrian. I am pseudo-Japanese, fourth generation, and culturally, it's an amazing mix of cultural experiences in Los Angeles itself, and the technology is absolutely amazing as far as the manufacturers, the materials. If you needed anything, it's somewhere in Los Angeles or in Burbank or in Orange County, etc. CNC, fabricators, milling, laser cutting, all of this is absolutely irrefutable, available somewhere in Los Angeles at some time or place, bizarre silicons, etc. So it's an amazing city for all of that. And then also, the schools, etc., are amazing individuals coming out of all of this as well for technology in the future and software and all of this sort of development, which we have in our own practice as well. So.
Great. So my name is Stas Orlovski, and my work primarily is drawing, painting, and printmaking. And somewhere around 2012, I took a very hard turn and realized that my images needed to be animated. And so more recently, I've been doing projects that involve moving image. And it's true. I think I've been in so many situations where things were falling apart at the very last minute, and it's shocking what you could do by picking up the phone in Los Angeles and what could be solved in what seems like it should take months, but you can make that one phone call and there's resources. And so I think in that respect it's an incredible place to be making the work that I'm currently making. And I think the other thing I'd say is my personal work is really inspired by early film history. Like pre-20th century moving image and projection. And so being in a place where you have, in a sense, film pushing the boundaries, right? Projects that are pushing the boundaries of the medium, I'm kind of exploring both ends of it, I feel.
I'm Sue Ann Robinson, and I, like Karen, use old technology because I make books. But when I moved to Los Angeles, Southern California, I moved from Washington, D.C. And if you were a dead artist in Washington, D.C., you did pretty well. But if you were a living artist, you had a lot of competition with the major industry there, which is the United States government. So coming here, what I found in Los Angeles was a real sense of openness, of possibility, of accessibility. You could almost just sort of walk in and say, I'd like to do this, and it could happen. So for one of the things I did very early on was create with some slightly newer technology called flexography. I actually printed a piece, but then got it distributed through the local newspaper. So it was kind of out of the box, in a sense, out of the covers of a book and out into the public sphere. So I just find that the sense of openness, the sense of possibility is always surrounding us as artists in Southern California.
I'm Barbara Strasen, and for me, my art comes out of painting, but it morphs into installation, and it morphs into digital collage, and it morphs into lenticular projects and images. And I know for me, having grown up in the New York area, that's the basis of my comparison. And I've always wanted to come to California because it seemed like the last frontier, the tabula rasa, the open possibility. And I've never been disabused of that notion. So early on when I was here, I wanted to combine unlike images, and I wanted to use the lenticular process. And at that time, I was commissioned to do a library ceiling, and it was actually possible to learn it on the internet and find out a way to do it archivally and large scale. And you just research it, you find out how to do it, you do it. You buy a laminator, you buy a press, you do it in your bedroom. That's it, problem solved. And I've also used other kinds of materials that came right out of Southern California. I was using a material called Celastic, which is what they used in Disneyland for a long time. I gave it up finally because you had to splash about in acetone for hours on end and you could kill yourself. But I've also used Tyvek and Yupo and plastic and acrylic paint, and you can drive a truck over it and nothing will happen. I mean, it's anything you think to do, you can do. And there's no history telling you that it's beyond the pale. You just jump in and do it and make it last, and you're good to go.
My name is Jane Castillo. I'm a native Angelino, and I agree with everyone here that LA is just fertile ground for resources, and it's really helped in the development of my artwork. I'm an installation artist, and being in Los Angeles, I feel that it was worth it to research my lineage and where I come from, and I was able to trace all of my mixed ethnicities to the sugar trade. And so I decided to incorporate technology and imagery in the way of using collage, but also using materials. And as far as my imagination can think of an idea to create, you're right in saying that in LA, if I needed to silk screen something, I could get that done right away. If I needed something done technologically speaking, yeah, we can get things done, and it's grants like the COLA grant that allow you the freedom to take risks and try new things. And that was something that I was really particularly grateful for when I got the COLA grant.
Hi, my name is Tran, but you might see it written out more formally as Tran T. Kim-Trang, so don't be too confused. I'm a media artist, and I've worked in a variety of forms, moving image, short experimental videos, to virtual space in Second Life, and now I'm working on the web, trying to put out games, but like casual games for mobile devices, but also older and more simple forms like the visual novel. So right now that's sort of where my practice lies. And I would just say that I agree with everything that everyone has said so far about the resources here in Los Angeles. I just want to underscore and echo the sentiment about the schools in this region as well. And I want to credit my teachers, Karen being one of them, for the encouragement and the push to experiment and innovate at CalArts. That's where I went to school. And I suspect that many of you probably had within your training, your school experience, that push to innovate and experiment as well. And now that I'm a professor myself, I definitely make sure that my students push the envelope in whatever ways they feel comfortable and have the ability, and that is the skills to be able to do that. I also credit the students too to constantly introducing me to new technology, right? Whether it's free software or VR or you know, the latest social media function feature, right? And that kind of thing. So I think I've been really lucky to have it coming from both ends of the spectrum. And I think some of our questions today will address that.
So what just the tag end of the main question from the DCA is, how does LA excite us to take intellectual and conceptual risks in advancing the boundaries of traditional art media? So I always found that an interesting question because I'm not interested in pushing boundaries, technologically speaking. I leave that to Silicon Valley and people who want to make a shitload of money off of it. But for me, I'm very conscious of how can we relate to media and technology through traditional practices that allows us in some way to hear the technology. I feel like technology becomes quite transparent in its utilitarian form, but what art does is actually frame it in a way which gives it a kind of ethos that we can actually scrutinize. Does that make sense? So I'd like to open this up to you. When you're dealing with technology, how much of it is the content in and of itself versus a way in which to frame other contents that the technology can help you access? So anyone like to sort of think about that?
I'm Amy Knoles, and you've all pretty much said everything I have to say, except for one quick point I wanted to make about Los Angeles artistically. For me, has been the collaborators, the never-ending stream of interesting, problematic, fabulous, annoying artists that I've had in my life. All of those things. I've never really created a piece of music unless I saw something visually, either on the wall or a movement from a dancer or video. So without that, I probably wouldn't have found a voice at all as an artist. And Los Angeles is very, very rich for that. For me, I have been an electronic percussionist since the dawn of MIDI, as they say, which is like 1985, 87. So it's been absolutely the most essential part of what I do. But I like to think of it as a fruit, that if you eat the whole fruit, the only thing that the solid that comes out are the seeds, and then that's the beginning of an idea. But I love the consummation of everything I can get my hands on technologically. Helps me to then distill what it is that I might want to do with something. So, and that's just ubiquitous in music software and music hardware and things that are coming out now. Yeah, how about anyone else on that one?
Yeah, between Hervig and myself, we absolutely have a very complex and very interesting sort of take on technology, though, too. So it's very double-edged. As a lot of our work, we can't do the work without high-tech computers, CNC milling, vacuum forming, all sorts of different technologies. But the interesting side of that is that, yes, a lot of this gets derivative and sort of boiled down to it's an expression of the technology itself. But really, it's also a lot of all the glitching and all of the mistakes. The interesting thing, the great thing about where we're at right now is it is really the wild, wild west. I consider it. It's not perfect. Nothing of the technology is perfect per se, or the parts that are perfect are very derivative in unto itself. So there's a strange sort of play between what's authentic and what is again absolutely repeatable and to a certain degree not as artistic as it could be, if that's a really long and whatever answer.
Sure. So to, I guess, expand or to respond to Tony's question, in my work, I never had any particular interest in technology. I came very much from mark making in a very traditional way. And when I needed to make those marks move in time, I went down the rabbit hole of trying to figure out how do you make something move. And one thing, of course, led to the next. And at the point that I'm at right now, the biggest question that I have in front of me is, just because you could do it, should you do it, right? Which I think maybe is a question that isn't asked often enough culturally. That sometimes we have the capacity to do things and we just do them because we can do them, and then wait to reflect on it afterwards. I think as artists, one of the interesting things is the constant negotiation between restraint and abandonment. Like, when do you let go and when do you hold back? And trying to figure out that dynamic with technology specifically is a really, really interesting question. So, you know, I feel like in some sense there's all this equipment, there's all these resources, all this knowledge, and sometimes I think that when I think about what I'm doing, I'm using one millionth of the capacity of what we have at our disposal, and those are questions that I think perhaps are in the sphere of what we do, right? Is when to use it and how to use it. Yeah.
I just think that Stas has pretty much nailed it, because the aesthetic of what you have produced is restrained. It's really the technology in service of your vision, rather than going full bore, as you say, down the rabbit hole and using everything possible. I think the storytelling that you do, you could have done a film, you could have done, color, you could have done a computer animation, but what you did do is very much your aesthetic and utilizes the technology.
So for me, the technology is just another tool. It's a means to an end, and one of the things that I like to do is take art history and bring it full circle. And I like to compare what's going on with us now with what may have shown up in an art historical painting from 400 years ago, and pick it because of its contemporary resonance. And so I use technology because often that's the best way to do it. One example was my COLA project, which was called Multiplex LA, Homage to Peter Paul Rubens. And it was the composition was based on Rubens' Triumph of the Church. So the composition, everything moves quickly to the right, and there are circles and carriage wheels and putti and monsters and things like that in the Rubens. But what I wanted to do is do an LA analog to that, so I went to the fabric district and I found a lot of shapes and bolts of fabric that looked like clumps of people and creatures. And I cut everything out digitally and then stacked it digitally and moved things around to replicate the composition. And that was the easiest way to do it, using Photoshop, so that's how I did it.
My work is about the U.S.-Mexico border, or at least it is now. When I had the COLA grant, I was working on with Moby Dick as an analogy to American psyche. But one of the reasons I started the border work was because I was looking at satellite images of the border, and I was just really amazed by the sort of horrible logic of it. And you have this unbelievably sophisticated technology to take photographs of something that are basically contour drawings, which is the most elemental form of human expression is found in cave art. So you have this odd juxtaposition between a kind of pre-civilized concept of space with a galactic concept of space. But I think that I worry when technology in my own work winds up being looking like stylistic vanity. It's like, oh, I can do this, and so therefore it looks great and it looks contemporary. I'm not interested in making contemporary work. I'm interested in making work that goes beyond that. And I think that one of the problems with technology in any of our work is that it winds up making us look faddish or fashionable, and I think that's short-sighted. Yeah.
So I would just add that it's very difficult for me to separate what you say from how you say it. So if you just sort of disregard the word technology for the moment, right, and just think of it as, well, how do I say what I want to say? Whether that's whatever form of technology you want to apply in there. So to me, the integration of the two, form and content, was what I was able to learn and what I'm now. So when I say I push students to innovate, it has to be the integration of form and content. Otherwise, totally agree with what you were just saying. Otherwise, it's just sort of like shallow use of a vehicle and not really thinking about it. And then we get into it in terms of like, well, why are you using that, right? Like, how does that add a layer to what it is that you're saying? And then it just falls apart, or some other problems come up. And then I think that that's a key to understanding that question.
I think you had this question, which I love this question. What is the cheapest technology? Oh, is it yours? What is the cheapest technology you've ever used, and did it surprise or disappoint? Because cheap technology doesn't get enough kudos. So then you have a cheap technology that you just fell in love with or just couldn't stand.
So this is actually kind of a follow-up to my original comment. So when artists were first able to use a computer to create work in slide form, right? So it was using new technology to create a kind of old technology. I projected them in commercial movie theaters in between the popcorn and trivia slides. And then for 3 years used the Lumley theaters. When we produced this project, it was the most high-tech way that you could make art at the time, other than sort of, stuff that was obscure that we didn't have access to at the time. But we decided that the way we would make the catalog was actually in a ViewMaster form. So we made ViewMasters of all the work that was light generated, because we didn't want to have a traditional catalog that was on print and that you couldn't see it the way it was meant to be seen in the theater. This was really important because the lawyers censored some of the work at the last minute. And I said this in other panels, you can exit this out, but some of the lawyers thought we had figured out how to subliminally put messages in the pixels. And so they decided to censor some of the work, and we kind of freaked them out. This is what happens when you deal with corporations, when you're trying to do a big public art project. So again, it's a really interesting way to distribute, because actually it's created in this really high-tech way. And I think in terms of my COLA grant, I've been actually creating work with glow-in-the-dark paint, which is actually a fairly low-technology platform. But my work is really about the history of ideas. And so for the COLA grant, I was projecting this movie I made that was a 40-minute movie on a glow-in-the-dark screen that I had painted. And this is an example of how technology can actually work with content, which is exactly how I use it. And so if you project an image on a glow-in-the-dark surface and you take that image away, there's a trace of that image left on the screen. When you project another image on top of that, the first image infects the next image. So there's no way to actually see a clear image without a trace of what came before it. And so I use that in really carefully constructed ways with images so that they would kind of blur into each other and never be, just a solo image without some sort of trace or historical context or something like that.
I think in terms of my COLA grant, it definitely was the cheapest technology, because I reconfigured older sculptures of mine. So it didn't involve actually I mean, the materials were all there. It was basically just looking at a piece that had already been completed, already been exhibited, already been published, and treating that as a raw material. So that was definitely the cheapest thing I had done. I've done other things along those lines, but it got more expensive because I had to involve foundries and things like that. But I think shopping your storage for materials is a pretty pretty economical way of doing things.
I was going to say, it's interesting thinking about like when I think of technology, I think of like kind of computers and what we think of high tech and things like that. But when I think about it in terms of art, I think about it more in terms of just like material, like technology as a material. And it's just because it's my process, and it's because it's the products that I do. And so for COLA, which it's an interesting question because it aligns really well with this idea of like low tech technology. I did everything in Scotch tape, so I did like these large renditions of the San Gabriel Mountains around LA, but just I rendered them completely in just layers of Scotch tape. And it really kind of conceptually had a lot of things going to it for me because it was such this ubiquitous office product that, you just use it day in and day out and don't think about it. But it was this thing that didn't really exist probably, about 70 years or so ago. So in terms of a technology, it's relatively new in art historical terms. But now it's to the point where it's just, you get it everywhere. It costs like 85 cents a roll or something like that. And it worked really well when I was thinking of like I'm building up these like mountains which get built up by layers and layers and layers of sediments or by earthquake eruptions or things like that. But it felt like there was this interesting process going on of me just all day, like 10 hours a day for like 7 or 8 months, just like applying Scotch tape to them.
We can get you help for that.
It was crazy, and I can't do it anymore because it just it was just like splitting open my fingers, and it was just. But it was an interesting it was just this interesting choice of material to kind of explore this idea of stupid labor, which is a little bit of what I have to do, or what I used to have to do a lot, in terms of trying to survive so that you can keep like feeding, the studio practice, and so you just do like job after job, and you think about, all the other things it can do. So it worked out really well, and it was kind of like a stupid technology that it worked really well for the time. So.
Yeah, I think again we have I have two different answers to that. So with us, the cheapest technology, ironically, is a computer too. So we make tons of iterations in the computer. We have a saying that we try to make as many mistakes as possible in the computer digitally. You make those mistakes digitally, and then see what works and doesn't work. So for us, it's all the iterations of geometrically and working this whatever we're doing, if that's the right approach, if we're going the right path, if this is the right sort of quote unquote look or whatnot. So that's on one side of it, and then the other side is zip ties and hand rivets. I think are amazing technology nowadays. That didn't exist. And so they're effective with the use of cops and everything, and also they are very effective with materials. So the hand rivets are also amazing, too. So, super cheap.
I'd like to mention why I actually brought that up. The first time that idea kind of rocked my world was working with a Polish electronic musician and composer, and we ended up forming a duo called Natural Plastic. Also odd technology, but he, out of necessity, living in Poland before the wall came down, getting his hands on certain technology was very, very difficult, and still it's prohibitive. In terms of monetarily, it costs a lot. An iMac or something costs a lot more for for them to acquire. But he came up with the most insane way of making the most beautiful music out of the craziest things. So he would take a keyboard, a Casio. Everyone's probably heard of Casio keyboards, and they usually have what's called a little modulation wheel and a pitch bend, and these things send controller data. And he wanted to be able to make gestures, electronically, and change music that way. And what he did was open up the keyboard and resolder a photoresistor to the potentiometers or the knobs on the keyboard or the sliders, and then hide the photoresistor inside of a broken mic cables housing, anything that was lying around, and then bring a light down here, and he'd reflect the light into his hand and then into the resistor to shape the sound. And he ended up putting it in his mouth and putting one here and here and one here, and we go, and amazing music would happen. And also you get this incredible image of his head that just was blown up, and it's just with this, and he put the one in his mouth, he put the photoresistor in a bent bottle cap. These things were housed in bottle caps, and it was the most absolutely amazing thing I've ever seen. So I've sort of kind of always tried to kind of get down to that level again, and use a soldering gun every once in a while so you remember where this shit comes from, right? Anyway.
I had this is making me realize I'm very bad about using cheap materials. I need to be more cheap, because I have this fetish for like cheap-looking things, but they wind up being very expensive to make. So it reminded me of one of my COLA pieces regarding Moby Dick. Was I had read the novel as a paperback on residency, and I found the first chapter just absolutely mesmerizing, so I wanted to make an exact duplicate of the first chapter in my paperback book with 90% of the text removed, and did a stream of consciousness kind of prose poem, where most of it was a blank page, but I wanted to do it in letterpress, and I wanted to do it the same size paper, the same quality paper. It wound up being very expensive, but it looked very cheap. But what was great is I was getting back to Los Angeles. I worked with an absolutely fabulous typesetter, Gerald Lang, who taught at USC and Otis. And even though he had incredible handset type experience, even he used this amazing process where you were making plastic silicon sheets of type. And in order to get the page the way we wanted, we did that process rather than handset type. But I think to some extent what we're talking about is material, right? It's a kind of an affection for material. And when the technology, whether it's cheap or expensive, allows itself for the material just to kind of ooze out its beauty, that's when we all feel, really lucky.
So for my COLA project, I worked in Second Life, which is a free software, but the labor power was extraordinarily expensive, and I'm happy to pay other people for that. So it was a really great steep learning curve for me to collaborate with a coder and coders who had a great aesthetic sense to build this virtual world that really spoke about my mother. And so the idea was to sort of create an afterlife for her in this virtual world of all the things that she had wanted but couldn't really have, like her children around her, and we would be doing everything that would be her favorite thing for us to do. So like I was eternally playing the piano, and Moonlight Sonata in particular for her, because, she really wanted, yeah, my personal hell. Yeah, but her, her fantasy, right? Like that's her nirvana. And so that was the idea, because I think in some Asian culture, the practice of sort of burning money or burning paper versions of worldly goods and material goods to send to the, the afterworld for your deceased loved ones, was sort of like where I sprung board from. And I think earlier you had talked about, does the technology allow us to sort of reframe or rethink or understand something differently about life that, just non-technological means wouldn't be able to do. So I think in that instance, it helped, because a friend of mine came up and said, "Oh my God, this is just like burning paper money for your mom," that kind of thing. But it just kind of took this very high-tech way to talk about it. So even though the tool was free, like how to use it was not. So I just think that's kind of interesting.
So for my COLA project, I made paintings with Xerox transfer. So they're basically photocopies with acetone to release the toner. And that was, pretty as inexpensive as it gets. But of course, that's really just a gateway drug to the printing press. So sadly for me, I became obsessed with the printing press. And, my background is not printmaking, so of course I have to work with a master printer to achieve whatever I want to achieve, and that is not cheap technology. That is very expensive, as Tony mentioned, with letterpress. So it's kind of a curious question about cheap technology, because some of the things that might seem low tech or relatively accessible, in fact, are some of the most precious, most complex things, and the things that we think would be super expensive are not, and it's just a matter of, I think, it's like for those of us that teach, is that constant argument of even, why can't you make an expressive line with a ruler? Why does it always have to be like this for it to be expressive? And if it's not with a ruler, then it can't be expressive. It's the same thing with materials, right? It's this idea that we use these precious things, and we have these expectations of what might be throwaway or inexpensive versus what takes a lot of resources.
For my COLA grant, I think I did the least expensive thing. So far. I think I got Scotch tape beat. Okay. I make books. I also teach people how to make paper. I have some issues with teaching people how to make paper because I feel that there is enough paper in the world already existing. So for my COLA grant, I used already existing printed matter, things that already were out there. So little brochures that you pick up in the dental office, in the insurance company, Knott's Berry Farm, all kinds of things. So I have all those pamphlets. They go back to the 50s. And I can construct books with those and modify them. And I don't have to print them. I can paint over them or cut them up or do all kinds of things with them.
I'd like to go back to the question about using very basic, simple technology and very elaborate 21st century technology. Often when I make lenticular works, I cannibalize bits of paintings or drawings that I've made and rephotograph them and insert them into the lenticular as a separate layer, and then combine them with, say, photographs of a concept that is either different from it or related to it. And then, to be really perverse, I like to often paint on top of the lenticular with acrylic paint, so that you can peek through the static network that's hand-painted to the moving, sliding around thing underneath. So it's a little bit of perversity.
I abandoned the cheap technology idea, knowing that I had started with something that I thought was relatively inexpensive. I had started using human hair. So I thought, okay, well, that's free. But then I started making bigger installations, and then I realized I needed to keep up with my own demand of my creativity and needing to create bigger work. So I started buying Kanekalon, which is the artificial hair. And then I started buying it in such large quantities that I quickly realized what I thought was a cheap material that I had grown, this affection for was now not cheap. So that has kind of framed my work after that. And for my COLA project, I still try to have humble materials, and I had these burlap bags. And I created my own fictitious sugar company because I could trace my lineage to the sugar trade in Colombia, South America. And so I know, because I like to work large, even my low tech that I think is relatively inexpensive always ends up being more expensive than I think.
I think the labor costs are really what we're all sort of talking about. That we think that working doing letterpress or working in film at a film lab, because it's an older technology. You sort of think, well, it's not going to be as expensive as 3D printing or something like that. But what I found, and I'm sure what everybody's found, is that there are these amazing people out there who really know what they're doing and who love what they're doing, and they love to be challenged. And so it's, for me, I can't always do this, but it's really great when I can work with somebody on a project, and I know it's not going to be cheap. I know it's we might actually call it more like analog technology, but the results are usually always pretty amazing when you're working with people who've been working for decades like this. And the thing is, a lot of people who are working in this way are not, finding their successors is the real trick now, because a lot of people aren't necessarily, especially at film labs, they're not really being encouraged to sort of train the next generation of people to do what they're doing, making 70 millimeter prints and things like that. So I kind of feel like even though certain things are actually going to be sort of expensive in terms of the labor, it's kind of like you have to do it now, because you don't know if you're going to be able to do it to the same extent in the future.
Why don't we go to the notion of the future and what we might want to use in the future? Are we going more towards high technology, or I know in the music industry, oddly, analog synthesizers are enjoying a huge resurgence. They are actually, I was corrected by the manufacturer of something that I recently acquired, that it's a hybrid. It's not just analog. It's a digital analog synth. And so in the music world, it's really a very, it's almost like a new frontier, but it's an old frontier. Everything old is new again. But it's been changed and improved in certain ways to make it easier to reproduce what you've done, say. What about, is that happening for other people in other fields? Is the analog coming back?
I think in film there are a lot of machines that are like printers. They're pretty much a kind of hybrid, and so it's not like anything is like strictly analog or strictly digital. I mean, some things are, but a lot of what I work with could be classified as hybrid. And I think in terms of the future, what I would really like, and what I think a lot of people really want, is just the choice to be able to continue working with certain processes and certain materials, and not have things disappear.
Right.
To try to continue to support people who, technicians who can really help you do the kind of work you want to do. I mean, what I discovered when I started working with film is that it wasn't, and this kind of gets a little bit back to the question of content. I realized, I started out thinking I was doing one thing, but then I realized that what I was doing was supporting a kind of ecology, that there are labs, there are materials, and more importantly, there are people, there are projectionists, there are all these parts, to the puzzle, and if one part goes away, then I can't keep doing what I'm doing. And so I think the future for me really kind of looks like, continuing to support the people who've helped me do the work I've done so far, but then also having access to what else is available. So it's basically, just wanting to have the choice to do as much, or to have as much access as you can.
Yeah, I found the lack of the ability to continue to use a certain device has caused me to change my work, and it can be really frightening. I actually flew to New York once when I play an electronic xylophone sometimes, and that company had filed bankruptcy, and I flew to New York and bought 2 more of those xylophones out of this guy's closet, just so that I would still have the instrument, and really now I don't use that much, and because there's always something, to change. Well, we're always going to change, we're not always going to be reliant, but it's an interesting question, and the support of the people that are sort of making these things for us that we couldn't make. We're not really making the technology quite as often as we are making our work out of it. So the support of people that make it possible is very, very important, has been.
I think that the idea of an old technology, for me, is still really interesting, because a lot of my students, for example, are working with computers all the time, and then when they have to learn how to bind a book with a needle and thread, they actually get a great deal of satisfaction out of that, and they know that that'll be around for a while, that it's not going to be out of date. It'll be accessible. And I'm reminded of a residency that I had at one point, where the residency was applying for a grant to support artists coming there, and they had no electricity. And the funders said, "No, we're not going to give you the money because you don't have electricity." And so they asked all of us who had been residents there to please write to the funder and explain that having a residency in a place where you really have to get up in the morning and go to bed as soon as the sun sets was a different experience, and it was really the experience of a lifetime, I think, just to be able to be back in touch with sunlight, nighttime, as your residents. They did get the grant, so that was great. But I think that the idea of technology can also be really a starting point for what you're trying to do. It doesn't have to be just a tool. It's also the inspiration, I think.
Yeah, as an architect, I think we have, and again, I've been giving all these answers all day, which are 2 sides of that. But on the bright side of everything, the future is insanely bright. It's the mass customization that's allowing, for incredible things to be customized, I think is really in the future, that is now. That's really be able to build these things cheaper, better, et cetera, et cetera. On the dark side of that, on the very dark side of that, and which also might be now, is technology is absolutely allowed, and nobody in this room is in this group, but has allowed a mass mediocrity to be disguised as the future or whatnot, where it's again it's derivative, inauthentic, and sort of just etc. I mean, and again, technology has absolutely allowed a lot of that. That's your drawings, 3D models, all these really cool technology things are allowing things to be so much quicker, cheaper, quote unquote, better, but not really better at all in any aesthetic sensibility to it. So a lot of our city right now is growing at an incredible pace, I would argue, but I would also argue at some very questionable aesthetics though too. So, but you know, the future is bright, but also a little dark.
This has been terrific, and I feel like I can speak for everyone. We would love to just sit here for another hour, but and we will. I have a feeling, but I really want to thank you on behalf of the moderators and myself. I really enjoyed this tremendously. So thank you so much.
Everybody, take your right hand. I know exactly. Great job.